Morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I learned recently that in Japan, every gata consists of 4 lines with 8 syllables each. If it doesn't have 4 lines and 8 syllables each, it's not a gata. And I had never realized that before, and so I sat down with the gata on opening the sutras, and it's close. It's 8, or yeah, it's 8 and then 9 and then 8 and 7 or something like that. But everything always gets changed around in translation. You know, it's hard to translate and fulfill some other language's requirements. I'm mentioning all this because I want to talk today about haiku, which also has a very strict formula, how it is to be written. Now, of course, outside of Japan, any abbreviated 3-line poem is a haiku. It's not the case inside Japan. Haiku in Japan is 17 syllables, and they're divided 5 syllables for the first line, 7 syllables for the second line, and 5 syllables for the third line. And if it does not match that criterion, it's not a haiku. Though I've heard that things have been changing somewhat about that. First, I got to get something out of my system. I drag this out about every 15 years, and I've never read this in this Zendo, and I'm going to do it this morning. These are 2 of my favorite poems, and they're not Japanese, they're American. Well, they're sort of like haiku. The first one is a very famous poem by William Carlos Williams, who wrote it in 1923. I'm sure that most of you have seen this poem at some point around. It's called the Red Wheelbarrow. It's the most anthologized poem in America. And I'll read it to you. It's very much like a haiku. The Japanese admire this poem. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow, glazed with rainwater, beside the white chickens.
Beside the white chicken.
Beside the white chickens.
Chickens.
Well, recently I found another poem that was written in 2002 by a woman by the name of F.J. Bergman. And I've looked up her site on the internet, and I think that I can certainly say that she's crazy. She is a poet, but she writes very interesting poetry. And this is a very interesting poem that she has written. This was a finalist for the 2003 James Hurst Poetry Prize. And it's called An Apology. Okay? Forgive me for backing over and smashing your red wheelbarrow. It was raining and the rear wiper does not work on my new plum-colored SUV. I'm also sorry about the white chickens.
Is that American?
Oh yeah, that is total America.
That's great.
Every time I'm feeling sad, I pull that out.
And the white chicken.
You know, we live in a world of samsara. This is where we live. And there's no getting out of it. We may from time to time catch a glimpse of nirvana, but it's only a glimpse. And it's certainly not a place where we can live. We yearn to be able to glimpse nirvana. It is something that we look for. It is something that we wish for. And I know that Zen students wish for it sometimes most ardently. For several centuries now, the Japanese have had a form of poetry called haiku, which sometimes affords a glimpse of nirvana. Haiku is not a poetry of the imagination. It is a poetry of mindfulness, based on actual experience. And it very often involves the juxtaposition of images in such a way that enables you to see beyond the poem, to see something much bigger and more important. And I thought it would be fun to examine some of these poems and talk about how they managed to do this. When I first started studying Zen, poetry was very much a part of my lessons. I think it had a lot to do with Jitsudo. Jitsudo liked poetry a great deal, and he encouraged everybody to write poetry and to read poetry and to perform poetry. But I can't think of any place that is currently doing this. You know, we used to have Joan Logie come and give courses and stuff like that. But I think that the modern attitudes are not that accepting of that art form any longer. And I'm kind of missing it. And so I thought this morning that I might talk about that a little bit. I was also inspired to talk about this because of something that Roshi has done. He wrote a book. And his book, which is an account of his hikes and accompanied with photographs, reminded me very strongly of an art form that was quite popular in Japan in the 17th century. And it was popularized by a gentleman by the name of Basho Matsuo. Basho. We all know Basho. Do you know Basho? Do you know Basho?
I actually quote him in the book.
Do you?
Mm-hmm.
Well, one of the great pillars of Japanese literature is this book by Basho, which is an account of a journey, by foot of course, that he took in the 17th century. That went north on the main island of Japan. And he gives a description of the things that he encountered, the people that he met, where he spent the night. And interspersed throughout this book, and as you can see, it's a substantial document, are poetry that he wrote. Haiku that he used to illustrate what he had seen. And he attempted to enable the reader to see more, you see. That was the purpose of the verse. So in a sense, they're like photographs, because they very often succeed in leaving you with an experiential impression of what he experienced, of what he saw. He was very good at this. He started out let me first say, he came from a rather poor family. His family was not a noble family. It was part of the samurai class, but it was at the lower end of it. They didn't have a lot of money. But he had a talent for a kind of poetry called renga, which was very popular at that time. It was a so-called lower form of poetry because it appealed to the common classes. And what renga was a kind of collaborative poetry, where one person would write a verse and then another person would come and add a verse to it, and another person would come and add a verse to it. But Basho's contribution to this was such that he really succeeded in transforming renga into a number of different kinds of poetry that became quite important. It was so important to Japanese culture that 100 years after his death, he was deified by the imperial government and by the Shinto spiritual headquarters. Too bad it didn't come while he was alive. So the first poem I'm going to talk about is a poem by Basho. And it is a poem that appears in this book. He had been traveling on the road for several days when he came to a field that had been a battlefield for a war between competing samurai clans. And it was quite famous, apparently, because a large battle had been fought there. And the destruction that it caused was still evident. And when he came to this field, he was overcome with sadness. And so he wrote the following haiku. Summer grasses, all that remains of warriors' dreams. That's all he wrote. This is a very famous poem that I think speaks to the transience of life. It speaks to the fact that everything appears and then disappears. And at that time, in Japanese culture, there was an aesthetic for this, and it was called mono no aware, which translates as the poignancy of transient things. Of course, transience is a very important component of our practice. And Basho was a Zen student. Trungpa made a very interesting comment about transience. He said that if we could really penetrate very deeply the transience of all life, of all things, that we would be enlightened in a second. This haiku, I think, is helpful in that regard. Let me go into a second haiku, which was written by a fellow who lived a little bit after Basho and was a great follower of Basho. He was also a remarkable visual artist. He was a painter. And he succeeded in bringing into popularity a form of art known as haibun.
What was it?
Haibun.
Haibun?
B-U-N. H-A-I-B-U-N. Which is poetry in combination with painting. He lived in the 18th century. He also, like Basho, was a Ringa poet, and he was a Buddhist priest. And he did a lot of illustrating of Basho's poetry, both in woodcuts and in paintings. A heavy cart rumbles by. Peonies tremble. You know, peonies and humans are equals in the universe, right? And what this poem is pointing to is that the natural world and the human world interpenetrate each other. That they both have an effect on each other. One touches the other. And everything is interconnected. If we truly understand this, then we can't possibly harm any other creature. This poem is about that interpenetration. You could even say that it is the ecology of peony trembling. Here's another haiku written by someone whom we all know, or know of. Robert Aitken. Robert Aitken wrote this haiku in the summer of 1944 when he was imprisoned in an internment camp in Japan. In 1944, Robert Aitken was 24 years old, and he had been captured on the island of Guam, where he was employed to help build a submarine base. So he was captured and taken back to Japan, to this internment camp, where he met an old, fussy British professor by the name of R.H. Blythe. He's this guy. He has written, well, he wrote, this came out I think in the early 1960s. He wrote a 4-volume history of haiku.
What was
Which-
Blythe doing in Japan?
Pardon?
What was Blythe doing in Japan?
He was translating haiku. His area of expertise was haiku.
So was he sitting out the war? I mean,
No, he was thrown in this internment
okay.
camp.
Okay, I see. Thank you.
I mean, he wasn't running loose.
He went from internment camp to internment camp.
Yeah. But Blythe sat down to learn how to write haiku, and here is one of his first efforts. The sun glitters on the path of a snail. You know, that is just so simple. I mean, it's just very bare. It's very naked. And then I think it's also very full.
Mm-hmm.
It's very full, especially if you know anything about what Aitken did later on with his study of haiku. Of course, he became the first American Roshi, Zen Roshi.
Oh.
And he had studied, after he'd been released from the internment camp, he went and studied with Son Nakagawa, who ended up in New York City, and who was very instrumental in bringing Zen to the West. And Nakagawa was also the teacher of Edo, Kaplo, and Aitken. It's not bad. But Aitken always used haiku to illustrate his talks. He always wrote haiku and he quoted haiku in an effort to illustrate what he was getting at. And one of the things that he was always talking about was what he referred to as the Tao of intimacy. And the Tao of intimacy was a phrase that encompassed, in Aitken's mind, karma as well as codependent arising. It spoke to synchronicity and to destiny. He used this to illustrate what he considered to be a very important aspect of reality. And that aspect was that, you know, sitting here in this seat, reading this koan, is the product of literally an infinite number of interconnections that had taken an infinite number of generations to bring to fruition. To me sitting right here. Everything that has ever happened in my life has led to me sitting here to read this haiku this morning. Aitken's haiku. You know, and I think that this is what he's speaking about in this poem. The sun glitters on the path of a snail. It is the conjunction of the sun and the path and the snail. On the one hand, you could say that there is no path, no sun, no snail. On the other hand, you could say that there is only the sun, and only the path, and only the snail. But
What season would that have been?
well, the snails were out. The sun was probably pretty high in the sky. I would say it would be summer. Most haiku have an indication of what season it is. And part of the game of the haiku is to figure out from the clues given what season it is. But it occurred to me, what he's saying here, I think, is that Shakyamuni twirled a flower, right? And the sun, many centuries later, gleamed off the slime that a snail left behind. That's how interconnected we are. The next one I want to read, I've got just two more I want to read. The next one I want to read is one by Son Nakagawa, who's Aitken's teacher. Picked by an old woman's hand, herbs green and glowing. Now, fortunately, Nakagawa commented on his own poem. So I'm going to read to you what he said. It represents a world where plus and minus are one, a world of absolute contradiction. To be dying is to be living, and to be living is to be dying. Death and life cannot be separated. They only have different names. Here, an old woman, a grandmother, is picking some herbs. As soon as she picks them, new shoots come up. I did not intend to create a haiku expressing the Zen viewpoint, but this is how things really are. Form is emptiness, emptiness is form. These two realms are the same. They're absolutely identical. It is the identity of the absolute and the relative. So, we are left with nothing more than an old woman and some herbs. And the final koan that I want to talk about is by Gary Snyder. I mean, how could we leave him out? Actually, we could, because he didn't write that many haiku, strangely enough. He wrote very few of them, but his longer poems are just studded with haiku. You could take any piece of them and read them as a form of haiku. But this is one that he intended to be a haiku. After weeks of watching the roof leak, I fixed it tonight by moving a single board. Now, if you know something about Gary Snyder, if you have read, for example, his book, it was published, 25 years ago, called The Practice of the Wild, you know that he espoused a particular kind of ecology and preached in favor of a particular relationship that he felt needed to exist between civilization and nature. And the best way to describe it is to say that the way we should be living on this planet is by going with nature instead of going against nature, which seems to be the way that we have been doing this. This has a great deal in common with a Hindu term called ahimsa. Has anybody ever heard of that? Ahimsa is sort of it means, first of all, it recognizes the interdependency of things. And it also recognizes that if nature is allowed to run its course, it will reach its own balance point. You know, the less that we do, the more we leave it alone, the quicker it'll reach equilibrium. Now, let me read the poem again. After weeks of watching the roof leak, I fixed it tonight by moving a single board. You see it? You know, here is a way to return to nature. Here is a way to honor nature with a single board. Okay, I'll leave you alone. No, I'm not going to leave you alone. I want to read an example of bad haiku.
You're gonna leave us with that?
Yeah, I want to do that because I think it really illustrates what I've been talking about. I want to leave you with that impression. This is a collection of haiku that have been written by young Americans. It was published, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago. And this is the kind of thing that they're writing. Through binoculars, a woman looking at me through binoculars. What do you think?
A little self-centered.
Clever, isn't it? Clever.
Wonder if he counted syllables.
Next to the wanted poster, the man with a goatee. Nothing.
Does Japanese have articles in it, the language?
I don't know.
Because
I doubt
English,
it.
we're pestered with articles, and it just blows haiku all
Well,
the time.
you may be right about that. You may be right about that.
And
Yeah,
the,
you know,
I don't think they do.
they mess with haiku in our language.
oh, stop.
Okay, here's a Basho haiku. Old pond,
Mm.
frog hop, kerplop.
Yeah.